The story I'm about to share with you happened just a couple of months ago, so the events are still fresh in my head. I also want to state for the record that my girlfriend does not know the extent of the story I'm about to tell. I realize that some people may disagree with me not telling her the full story, but I'm trying to protect her peace of mind. My girlfriend and I just moved into a beautiful new home. I wish I could say that we bought the home, but we were just renting. Anything was better than living in the cramped apartment we were currently living in, though. We weren't looking for a new place to rent either. It just so happened that this place fell right into our lap. I wouldn't go so far as to say they were a friend, but an acquaintance of my girlfriend's father ran into him. This man, who we'll call Brian, told my girlfriend's dad about this great house he had bought and asked her dad if any kids of his would be interested in renting it. Of course, knowing our apartment situation, he recommended it to us right away. We were a bit hesitant to see it at first. I'm not sure why. I guess the idea of moving into a place we weren't buying just seemed off the table, since we were both in school. As soon as we entered this house for the first time, though, we both fell in love with the place right away. It was way bigger than it appeared to be on the outside. The living room, dining room, and kitchen were all in the big open floor plan, which ordinarily I don't really care for, but I loved this one. The walls in the living room had this cool-looking built-in bookcase, and I don't mean just a little one either. It was the entire wall. The other wall had a fireplace. It was just such a great ambiance. I loved it even more than my girlfriend. Along with this beautiful floor plan, we were getting 2 huge bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a massive 2-car garage. Brand new appliances too, including a washer and dryer. The coolest feature, though, was the basement of the house. The house had a fully finished basement with a built-in theater. All the wires were already hardwired into the wall, and all you had to do was go down and press play. So now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what's the issue with all this? It all seems amazing. Oh yes, all of that is amazing. But Brian, the landlord, was not so amazing. As I said, we fell in love with the house and told Brian we wanted to rent it. Conveniently, our lease was up in a month anyway. That meant it all worked out perfectly. This guy was really weird though. He was a single middle-aged man that just liked to spend money. He had more money than he knew what to do with, it seemed, hence buying this property just because he could do it. He was short, bald, and slightly overweight, but that's not what made him weird. What made him weird was his personality. He would just stare at you with this strange, uncomfortable look. He would go from extremely erratic and excited to not making a sound and getting a 1,000-yard stare. This may sound like nothing to you, but you had to be there. The look he got in his eyes was so unnerving. It was as if he was always contemplating doing something bad. Fast forward to the end of our lease. We moved in. Every landlord I ever had has been kind of weird, so I didn't really let his weird presence bother me. Besides, we loved this house so much. I didn't find out until we'd actually moved in, though, that Brian lived right next door. That was exciting for me. We moved all our stuff in one weekend, and by Monday we were all set up in our new home. It didn't take very long to feel right at home either. That's thanks to my girlfriend. The first week we were there was when I had my first encounter with Brian. My girlfriend is currently well underway with her nursing degrees, so to make ends meet, she bartends on the weekends. Some nights, she doesn't get home until 3 a.m. The first Saturday night of being in our new home, I was just lying on the couch in the living room, relaxing with our dog. It was probably around 11:30 p.m. She was still at the bar working. All of a sudden, I heard the front door open. I jumped off the couch trying to think why she would be home so soon. And to my surprise, there was Brian. He was just kind of standing there looking at me. I asked him if he needed anything and what he was doing. I was trying to show that I was a bit angry, but for some reason I was also still trying to be somewhat respectful. My girlfriend's dad was kind of friends with the guy?" A few seconds passed by, and he said in a low, drawn-out voice, I was just stopping in to see if you're settling in okay." I nodded, and then he slowly turned around and left. I made sure I locked the door behind him. I thought I had locked it earlier, but it's possible I'd forgotten that night. When she got home, I told her about the encounter, and she just kind of laughed. She said that Brian sometimes had a few too many drinks, and he'd probably just walked into the wrong house on accident. I was happy she was able to laugh it off, but I still felt uncomfortable. A week passed by, and I'd almost forgotten about Brian's surprise entrance. Around 9 that night, though, I heard a car door shut, and I looked out the window. I saw Brian walking into his house. I figured my girlfriend had been right. Probably just mistakenly walked into the wrong house. Happens to everyone every now and then. That night, I ended up dozing off on the couch while watching a movie. I was waiting for my girlfriend to get home from the bar. I was jolted awake a little after 1 to the door slamming. It was Brian again. He looked very angry and a little bit disoriented. He was wearing jeans and a torn-up tank top. He was in the center of my living room just standing there. By the time I got to my feet this time, I gave him some attitude. I grilled him as to why he was inside my house. He looked around as though I wasn't even there. I just wanted to see the place. Before I could lose it on the guy, he turned around and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I was a bit freaked out and concerned. Was this going to be a common occurrence with this guy? My girlfriend was surprised to see me awake when she got home. I told her I couldn't sleep, and that's why I was still awake. I decided not to tell her about Brian visiting, though. I could tell she was under extreme stress from school and work, and I didn't want to ruin the only place she felt comfortable. The next few nights, I barely slept. I would toss and turn in bed constantly, getting up and checking the locks multiple times. A few nights after the last encounter, I got out of bed at 2 a.m. I went into the kitchen to grab some water, only to be surprised by him just standing there. Brian was in the kitchen, facing me and not moving. I can't even begin to explain to you the terror I felt in that moment. He was illuminated by nothing more than the light outside. Trying not to alert my girlfriend, I slowly put my hands up in a defensive position. Without any further words, he walked calmly out of the house and shut the door quietly behind him. I stayed in the living room for the rest of the night, just staring at the front door. The next day, I went over to confront Brian while my girlfriend was at school, but he was gone. I waited all afternoon, but he never came home. After a few days, he still had not come back yet. I casually mentioned to my girlfriend that Brian didn't appear to be home. She told me that he went on a trip to Japan for 2 months. If we needed him for anything, he'd given us the phone number of a friend nearby. Brian's been back home for about a week now, and I've yet to see him. I've been up most nights just watching and waiting for him to try and come inside. I will eventually tell my girlfriend when school calms down for her and I know that we're safe. I still plan on confronting Brian one of these days. I'm just trying to figure out what to say. If anything else happens or there are any further developments, I'll surely update everyone. Does anybody out there have any thoughts to explain this guy's behavior? Maybe he has some type of disorder, or maybe he's just flat out dangerous. Any advice would be greatly appreciated, because I don't think I can live like this for much longer. Sleepovers tended to be an exciting event that always proved to be an enthralling adventure. There's nothing quite like hanging out late at night with friends, talking about anything and everything. As a kid, I would always look forward to the next sleepover. That is, until one dread-filled night from 9th grade that I'll never forget. I've told this story a few times. Some people sort of shrug it off and tell me I overthink things, which might be true, but honestly, this night has stuck with me long into adulthood. I wanted to share and see what everyone else thinks. This night started out like any other get-together with my friends. It was my friend Hanson's birthday, and he had 6 of us stay overnight. We had all been friends since the 4th grade, and every year on his birthday, he would have this awesome sleepover. Hanson had an awesome house. It was huge, gigantic really. The house had those big cathedral ceilings and tons of rooms. It was a 3-story home with a massive backyard, so we would often play football in the backyard, then play basketball on the full outdoor court he also had back there. We seemed to always have an endless supply of soda, Gatorade, and whatever snacks we wanted. Just to get to his house, you would have to turn down a long driveway. And travel about 100 yards or so down a dirt road until you finally pulled up to this enormous mansion, for lack of a better word. At this point, I'm sure it goes without saying, but Hanson's family had a lot of money. We had free reign of the house whenever we went there. We would often play hide and seek when we were younger. Not so much when we got to be older, though. The only rule from Hanson's father was just to never go in the basement. It kind of reminded me of that Goosebumps book every time he would remind us to stay out of there. Just like clockwork, though, every time we showed up, Hanson's father would drop in on us in the living room and say in his chipper voice, "Hey there, fellas. Just a reminder to you to stay out of the basement, okay?" Then he would just giggle and walk away. Well, this year, my curiosity got the better of me. I asked Hanson what was in the basement. He responded in a normal voice, "I'm not sure. We're not allowed to go down there, so I just don't ask. Probably something to do with his work, I think." At that moment, I realized I had no idea what his father did for a job. I asked Hanson, almost as if it were turning into an interrogation, "What does your dad even do?" This is when I saw the wheels start spinning in Hanson's head. It dawned on me that Hanson had no clue what his dad did either. Finally, he said honestly, I don't really know. I think he does something with finance or something like that. He has to leave on business all the time, but we just don't ask about it. You know, now that I think about it, he told us when we were younger that we wouldn't understand, so we just kind of stopped asking. I guess I don't really think about it anymore. That honestly left me so unsatisfied. But somehow the conversation got changed quickly by another friend, and we started doing something else. All night, though, I was stuck up thinking about that basement and what could possibly be down there. Around midnight, we were just playing video games and eating leftover pizza in his living room. I told my friends I would be right back, so I could go to the bathroom. Actually, though, I was going to see if I could get into that basement. Just standing in the narrow hallway with the basement door at the end gave me chills. My whole body was really tense. I tried to keep telling myself it was just a room, and nothing down there could be all that bad. I got close to the door, but before I even attempted to open it, I noticed there was one of those door cameras on that door, and it was sealed tight with a padlock as well. What on earth could he have had down in that basement that required such security? I walked back to the living room, and at that point I could feel my fascination turning into obsession. Finally, around 3 a.m. or so, we all started to crash. I was sleeping on the floor. Honestly, I liked being able to spread out. I didn't care if I had the couch. I'm not exactly sure what time it was, but I was awoken to a voice. I opened my eyes and looked around the dark room. As my eyes started to adjust, it was dark but not pitch black. The moon was still pretty bright enough I could make out the corners of the room at this point. I figured it was just a dream and decided to lie back down. As I put my head on the pillow, though, that's when I heard it again. This time, though, I recognized the voice. It was the voice of Hanson's father. I rolled over and noticed I just so happened to be laying near a vent that was open. I could hear his father talking to someone down there, maybe on the phone or something. At first, the sound was kind of faint, but the more I woke up and began to focus, the clearer his voice became. The chipper voice he always greeted us with for years was not present anymore. His voice sounded almost menacing. I don't even know how to begin to interpret what he said down in the basement. I heard him say something like, "No, that's unacceptable. I'm not accepting failure on this. If I have to come and do this for you again, this will be the last job you ever have." Alone, that sentence sounds threatening but not objectively scary. It's what he did next that made my blood run cold. He just started to scream, like irrational screaming. I heard something slamming, the sound of footsteps. It was Hanson's father coming upstairs. I heard the basement door shut, and he walked slowly to the archway that looked down into the living room. I could feel him staring over at all of us. It made me extremely uncomfortable. Somehow I could feel that he knew something was not right. Morning came and I didn't sleep at all. Hanson's parents woke up early and made us all breakfast. His father looked at me and he said in his once again chipper voice, "What's wrong, bud? Not hungry?" I stupidly responded, "I don't feel that good. I didn't get to sleep very well last night." I noticed his chipper smile fade to an uneasy smirk and then a slight frown. "Sorry to hear that, bud. I hope nothing in particular kept you up." Almost immediately, he excused himself and walked away from the table. That morning, we went outside and shot some hoops until our parents came to pick us up. My mom pulled over and I went inside to grab my bag. I was confronted by Hanson's father. He put his hand on my shoulder. "I saw you were looking at the basement door last night. Got anything you want to say to me or ask?" I nervously said no and walked back to my mom's car. As she pulled away from the enormous property, I could see Hanson's father staring at me from the middle of the driveway. I mentioned this one time to Hanson at school, and he just sort of laughed and said his dad yells all the time. Every other time I went to his house after, his father never greeted us anymore. When 12th grade came around, Hanson left our school and moved away. He said it was for his dad's work, and that was the last time I would ever see him. We're friends on Facebook, but we don't talk much anymore. That story took place almost 20 years ago at this point. For years, I wondered if his dad was doing something shady down there, or if he had a really important, sensitive job to deal with. After all, I didn't technically see anything wrong. I didn't even really hear anything incriminating. It was just the vibe I got and the tone of his voice that gave me all these uneasy feelings. Does anybody out there have any idea what this could have been, or what Hanson's father could have been doing down in the basement? Anything would give me some peace of mind. For about 7 years of my early 20s, I worked as support staff for a company that provided residential services to people with mental disabilities. It was a pretty cool job until this occurrence. The house I worked in was dedicated to the care of 14 to 18-year-old boys. We would often receive different clients who would stay with us for any length of time, short-term, some very long-term. Jeffrey was a 15-year-old autistic teenager. He was a great kid, and I never had any problems working with him or any issues with his behavior. His parents simply weren't equipped enough at home to provide the care he needed. His family, meaning his mother, father, and sister, would come to visit just about every weekend, which was really nice. Some parents would just drop off their children and never return. Jeffrey's sister was also disabled, but not as severely as her brother. We'll call her Sally. Sally is 20 years old, at least 230 pounds, and more often than not reeked of body odor. She wore dirty clothes and had long greasy hair. She had a face covered with acne and scars. Sally would always watch me whenever they visited, not just watching me work, mind you, but watching literally every move I made. She often tried to flirt with me, and it made me extremely uncomfortable. I would usually just ignore it though, as she was a family member of one of our patients, and she wasn't really doing that much wrong. After a little over a year with us, Jeffrey transferred to another residential house. After he had moved, he added me as a friend on Facebook, due to the fact that we no longer shared a professional relationship. I added him back, and Jeffrey began to message me no less than 20 times a day. I would reply occasionally. I figured perhaps he wasn't liking his new house, or maybe he just wanted to keep in contact. Most of his messages were just a simple, "Hey, what's up? How's your day going?" After about a month or two though, the messages picked up in pace. At least 2 messages an hour, all hours of the day and night, literally all 24 of them. After receiving a message stating it was very rude to ignore someone's messages and not reply, I deleted and blocked Jeffrey on Facebook. Not long after that, it went from being annoying to very unnerving. Everything was pretty quiet for a while and returned to normal for about 1 month. One night after work though, I came home to my normal apartment. I made myself dinner, played some Xbox, and went to bed. In the early morning, there was a knock at my door. I checked, but there was nobody there. I figured they just knocked on the wrong door, as there were several people living in the same complex at the time. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, my dog started to growl and bark ferociously. I awoke to the sound of the large window in my living room shattering completely. I immediately turned on the bedroom light and dialed 911. To my surprise though, the attempted intruder was caught almost immediately by security. Even more surprisingly, the police showed up much quicker than I thought they would. They assessed the damage and made sure that there was nobody in my apartment and nothing was missing. Before they left, they brought me outside to see if I could identify the caught intruder. When I walked outside, a part of me was shocked. There sat Sally, handcuffed in the back of the squad car. I was able to identify her immediately. In the aftermath, the police discovered she had been planning this for a long time. She had hacked into Jeffrey's Facebook, which he hadn't used in a very long time. Every message sent from that account had been from her. She had been keeping several diaries and would write about me and fantasize all the time. Her tone would often change from happy and loving to angry and disturbed. She wrote more than once about ending my life. In court, those diary entries were presented as evidence. That was the most disturbing part of it all. She was convicted to 6 years in prison for breaking and entering, and due to her various diary entries, she was also charged with premeditated intent to commit assault with a deadly weapon. Last I heard, her family had moved far away, and I can't say I blamed them much. I eventually found a new place to live. I just wasn't comfortable there anymore. Tensions were high around our apartment complex when I was around the age of 10. In a month's time, we'd had a man commit suicide, a partial fire in a building leading to reconstruction, and a child who had been hit by a car. Even at a younger age, I distinctly remember having a strong grasp on the bizarre events that were taking place. It had to be around spring of '97. My mom was single and raising me and my little sister, who was about 5 years old. She managed a different complex. She would pick us up from school and drop us off at our apartment when she returned to work for a couple of more hours. I have 3 older siblings who all moved out at this point. We had to keep an eye on each other at a young age. This wasn't really a new premise for me. There was no money for a sitter. The oldest just had to assume the role. That was me for the most part. We were really quiet kids. We played with our toys, watched a little television, and sometimes played Sega or Nintendo. On this particular afternoon, I recall playing with my Star Wars figurine, while my little sister was doing whatever in the same living room. Suddenly, the doorknob began to violently shake. My heart dropped. I remember that being the first time I ever felt such terror. I rushed to the phone and paged my mom, then dialed 911 to let the operator know someone was breaking in. The operator reassured me that help was on the way. The door handle was being violently messed with the entire time. I was nervous if the deadbolt and flimsy chain would be enough to hold the door. Many loud bangs began to happen, as if someone was ramming their door with their shoulder and entire body. Then it just stopped altogether. The cops arrived shortly before my mom, only to find the maintenance man saying there was an air filter check. Now, the maintenance man claimed he announced himself verbally, but I knew that was horseshit. Of course, the cops did nothing. My mom's complaint with the office didn't result in the man being fired either. Unfortunately, this would not be the most unnerving part of the story. My mom said the guy would stare her down in the parking lot after and just smile at her. The whole situation creeped us out, and we wanted to move. We couldn't afford the expenses though. One night, a couple of weeks later, I was awoken by a loud thud coming from the roof. I was rattled and ran to my mom's room to wake her up. She checked around to make sure everything was in place and assured me it was probably just a rodent. We went to school the next morning and were dropped off at home in the afternoon as usual. My mom did a quick sweep of the place even before the attempted break-in, but this time something seemed off. It was just a very uneasy feeling that came over all of us. It happened as we walked into our apartment. My sister and I were ordered to stay downstairs by the front door while she investigated upstairs. We waited patiently and felt very unnerved. Our mother's sudden shrieking confirmed our suspicions. She came barreling down the stairs and ushered us out the door. We ran to a neighbor's house and phoned the police. My mother was barking at them over the phone that someone was in our apartment. The police responded pretty quickly, and I was finally able to understand the situation. The bedroom had a walk-in closet that contained a hatch to the attic. It connected the entire building's AC and heat. There were shelves that were pretty high up lining the closet walls. My mother had walked in to find a dirty pair of men's underwear lying on the floor. This was enough to send her running and phoning the police. The investigation revealed something more. The attic hatch had been disturbed. Just to add, the police found full handprints on the shelves in the closet. The noises I'd heard the previous night were more than likely this man hoisting himself back up into the crawlspace using the shelves to climb on. After visiting us, the man was taken into custody. I don't recall what the sentencing was though. We ended up moving to my grandfather's house shortly after. One summer, a friend and I took a trip to the US. We were both Irish guys in our early 20s. We took Greyhound buses and Amtrak from place to place. Since I'm the more organized one, I looked after our booking, tickets, and reservations. When it came to staying in Chicago, I thought I'd struck real gold by finding a room at the Hilton at a ridiculously affordable price. It seemed like a major upgrade to the places we'd been staying in so far. As we got off the train after our journey from New Orleans, though, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The hotel was in Addison, Illinois, not the Chicago neighborhood of Addison where we'd planned on staying. It was a blip on the map at the time, consisted of little more than a road sign, a petrol station, a White Castle, and our hotel. Luckily, the hotel offered a discount taxi service through a cab company they were affiliated with. They sent someone out to pick us up. This is where things took a turn. The guy who showed up popped the trunk. Just as we were putting our bags in there was a roar from behind us. "Hey, you can't take that cab. He has out-of-town plates. That's against the law." A burly cabbie was enraged by the fact our driver had to pick us up right in front of a queue of cabs. I got about 2 words into my explanation when our driver lunged for the guy, screaming, "You fucking bastard, I'll kill you right here. I have my iron pipe, and I swear to God I'll beat you till you die." Looking back, this is where we should have brought things to a halt. But the truth is, we didn't have enough money for a normal cab to ride somewhere so far out of town. Being the 2 awkward Irish guys we were, we just got into the car and gazed in the opposite direction. We hoped the matter would resolve itself just fine. I'm not proud of that. After jumping back in the car, still cursing at the other driver, our driver gunned it down the wrong side of the street at rush hour, evidently making up for lost time, all while venting road rage in the direction of any honking horns. It seemed like the man had been drinking heavily, but bailing out of a car moving this fast genuinely seemed like a terrible idea. At some point, between claiming he should have been a race car driver and calling us pussies for wearing seatbelts, He told us a story about how he'd recently beaten the shit out of a customer who didn't tip him enough. In my head, I tried to play this off as just slightly unnerving, if not a terribly effective way of ensuring a fat bonus, but my friend was nervously counting a handful of sweat-soaked $1 bills. That gave me a sinking feeling. While I looked after all the booking and reservations, he was supposed to be responsible for things like taxi fares between us. We had enough cash to cover the trip before the tip. This is where things started to escalate from a vague threat to certain danger. As the cab driver watched us in the rearview mirror, he offered to show us his iron pipe, the same one he'd used to take care of the bad tipper before. Despite our polite objections, he actually grabbed a pipe out from under the seat, turning and waving it around at us with a maniacal laugh, while the car sped on without him looking ahead. I couldn't tell which was scarier, the feeling we were about to crash at any moment, or the looming confrontation when we were inevitably short on his tip. We were going so fast that the force of the wind coming in the open window took my breath away, intensifying the feeling of shock. Definitely the most distressing journey I've ever been on. Miraculously, the speeding shaved enough valuable dollars off the total that it left just enough for a small tip. He decided not to beat us to death. We had been saved by the very excess that terrified us. I jumped out the moment we stopped, searching for help just in case things kicked off. The driver seemed satisfied though. He handed us his card and said to call him anytime. He would glad to drink whiskey and get into some fights with us. No thanks. Once we got to safety and our hotel room, we just sat there shaking, shell-shocked and trying to absorb what just happened. This happened 3 years ago, when my twin brother and I were 15 years old. Our bedrooms are situated right next to each other on the bottom floor of the house. My parents' master bedroom is on the second floor. One night, I was awoken to some commotion going on in my brother's bedroom. I sat up in bed, and a minute after I'd sat up, my mom walked in with my brother. It sounded like they were arguing about something. My brother had nightmares often back then, and this night he claimed he saw someone looking in through his window at him. He'd grabbed his cell phone and called my mom as the stranger stood there watching him. While telling her what was happening, I guess the person disappeared. My mom had a feeling he was just having a nightmare, but he insisted he had been wide awake and there really was someone outside. My dad investigated, but he didn't find any trace that anyone was out there. This same thing happened another time a few nights later. This time, though, it was a bit different. I was awoken abruptly to my brother entering my room in a panic. I asked him what the hell he was doing, irritated that he'd suddenly woken me up. I saw he was almost in tears, though. He was whispering, "That guy is back. He's outside my window." The tone of his voice suddenly made a chill wash over me. I knew he was not dreaming or having a nightmare. He sat in my dark bedroom with me, but before we even had a chance to think of what to do next, we heard a loud thump against the wall. My bed is pressed up right against that wall, and on the other side was my brother's bedroom. He looked at me in terror. I was rapidly trying to make sense of what the hell was happening. Right after, we heard a second louder thump and sat in disbelief. A minute later, my phone started ringing. It scared the hell out of both of us. I silenced the noise, but I didn't answer the call. It was my brother calling. I looked up at him in horror and confusion and showed him the number on the screen of my phone. His eyes became wide and he started to tremble. I rejected the call and immediately called up my dad. He answered in a tired voice, and I told him someone was in our house. He asked me what I was talking about, not wanting to believe what I'd just said was a reality. I told him again, though. I heard him promptly rush down the stairs so fast. He practically ripped open my bedroom door. My brother and I told him that just a few feet away from where we stood, in my brother's bedroom, was a hidden intruder. My dad had never faced with anything like this before, so I could tell he was scared when he realized he had to go check it out. My brother and I followed closely behind him. The window was wide open, and my brother's cell phone was lying on the ground in the middle of the floor. We didn't find the person. We installed cameras around the house the next day, but whoever it was has not returned since that night. We think whoever it was that was in my brother's room must have seen us installing all those cameras. When I was in my teens, my parents took a vacation, but left their cars in the driveway. It was just my grandmother who lived in our house, my younger sister, and myself for almost 2 weeks together. One random night, I woke up to our dog growling and the motion sensor lights in our backyard turning on. I got up and walked toward the front of the house when I noticed a shadow coming through the bottom of the door crack. Somebody was standing on the other side. I slowly creaked my way to the peephole, and when I looked out, I saw an eyeball looking in. I froze for a second in panic, then rushed to the phone and called 911. As I was running away from the door, the person began to slam on the front door and gave off a laugh I can only describe as absolutely insane. As I'm on the phone with the police, I run to one of the windows to see if I can see what this person looked like. That was when I noticed an old beat-up car speeding off down the street. I never knew who that was or why they were there. The police believed it was a burglar, thinking nobody had been in the house because the cars hadn't moved in days. I'm not really sure what to think. I was home alone for a weekend a few years ago while I was still in high school. After school one day, I was driving home. When I passed in front of my house, I happened to look up and see what I thought was a lady in white clothes in my sister's bedroom looking out through the window. I cautiously crept into the house and slowly went to her bedroom to check it out, but when I arrived, there was no one there. I was about ready to chalk it up to a ghost or something, but I pretty much forgot about it. That was until later that night when I got a call from a very panicked and scared neighbor. She told me that she too could see some random lady pacing back and forth in my sister's bedroom. I sprinted up to the room to check again, but whoever it was no longer there. I haven't seen hide nor hair of this mysterious woman in white since, and nothing like that has ever happened again. From about 5th through 9th grade, my best friend Natalie and I were pretty much inseparable. We lived only a few streets away from each other in an idyllic little town in the Midwest. It was the kind of place that feels like living in a time capsule of the 1950s. Charming homes with beautifully kept gardens, huge old maple and oak trees lining every street, and neighbors who actually stop and greet each other as they walk their dogs or mow their lawns. Summer block parties, kids playing in the street until dinner time, that sort of thing. Natalie and I used to walk to and from school together every single day. I often stayed over at her house for about an hour after school, while my parents were still at work. I loved hanging out at her place because her mom was the sweetest person ever. She would serve us delicious snacks, and we would tell her about all the hottest middle school drama. She'd even let us watch a TV show or play a computer game before we started our homework. Natalie's dad worked a lot and wasn't around often, but whenever I did interact with him, something about him seemed off on a superficial level. He was perfectly nice, friendly, and even funny. He had a great sense of humor and was always joking around with Natalie and I. He also joked around with the rest of our friends on the few occasions they were all around. But even though I didn't sense a single bit of discomfort from any of my close friends, I couldn't help but feeling uneasy in his presence. For one thing, he seemed a little bit too touchy-feely. It was subtle, but it was always noticeable in little ways that made me uncomfortable. Here's an example. One weekend, he took me, Natalie, and 2 of our friends to a cider mill. We picked apples, drank cider, and went on hay rides together. When the ride was over, Natalie's dad was helping each of us off the side of the wagon. I was the last in line. Something about the way he grabbed my friends by the waist and let his hands linger just a touch too long once they were already safely on the ground started to weird me out. When it was my turn, I just jumped off the wagon before he could even touch me. He looked a little surprised but didn't say anything. Fast forward to Natalie's 12th birthday party. She had a sleepover with about 10 girls there. We arranged our sleeping bags on the floor of her living room, since it was the biggest room in the house. The living room wasn't really closed off by any doors. It had a big opening that connected it seamlessly with the foyer in the front hallway of the house. I was sleeping near that hallway, which I wasn't too pleased about. I preferred to sleep surrounded by other people whenever I went to sleepovers. I've always been super afraid of the dark, and having everyone around me was like an extra layer of protection, as silly as that sounds. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly awoken by a hand pressing down on my arm. I didn't jolt awake or anything, but I did slowly open my eyes and turn my head to survey my fellow partygoers. They were all dead asleep, some even lightly snoring. That was when I began to hear a quiet giggling behind me. Still lying down, and now officially frightened, I turned my body to face the foyer. The opening in the wall that connected the living room to the foyer was a big sweeping arch. On the right side of that arch, I could just barely see the top of a man's head peeking out from behind the wall. I noticed his fingertips were spread out on the wooden floor, and he was crouching down. It was Natalie's dad. I honestly had no idea what to do. Was he just kidding around? Didn't it occur to him how creepy this was to do? Should I say something or just awkwardly ignore it and try to fall back asleep? Being my timid, non-confrontational preteen self, I decided to try the latter route first. I turned back on my other side and scooted in as close as I could to my sleeping friends next to me. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep, despite being obviously and understandably petrified. I'm not sure how long it was before I was woken up again. This time it was by a firm tapping against my temple. Knowing exactly who it was this time around, I tried my best not to indicate I was awake, struggling to keep my eyes closed. My breath was slow and deep. Again, I heard the same stifled giggling sound. This was particularly disturbing because it sounded almost manic. It was like he thought this whole routine was absolutely hysterical and could barely contain himself, even though he was a grown man. It had all the giddiness of a 5-year-old playing hide-and-go-seek with his older siblings. Yet again, I had no idea what to do in this situation. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to acknowledge him or what. I turned to face the foyer again, and just barely caught a glimpse of his head disappearing behind the wall in that same crouched position. More giggling. I turned back and scooted even closer into one of my sleeping friends, partially waking her and causing her to shift around a bit. I hoped she would wake up completely, but she just turned over and quickly drifted back off. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter over my shoulders. I heard what sounded like someone shuffling on all fours down the hallway. I don't remember how I got back to sleep that night, but somehow I did. The morning finally arrived, mercifully enough. Natalie's parents made us all pancakes, but her dad was acting completely normal. He didn't pay any particular attention to me. He didn't make it a point to ignore me either. He just interacted with me like he always did. He was smiling, joking, and friendly. A couple of months later, Natalie had another sleepover. This time, I made sure to secure a spot in the exact center of everyone, far away from that front hallway. Later that night, I was interrupted in the middle of a deep sleep for seemingly no reason. I had been sleeping on my back. Suddenly, I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling wide awake almost instantly. I was overcome with the most intense feeling of dread. I felt like I couldn't move. It was like my limbs were being weighed down by some invisible weighted blanket. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I slowly turned my head toward the front hallway. As my eyes adjusted in the darkness, I could see Natalie's dad and mom standing in the entryway, looking directly at me, with the most hateful expressions on their faces. Their arms were stiff and straight at their sides. I'll never forget how disturbing their faces looked, contorted into pure rage that only seemed to grow in intensity the longer I looked at their eyes. Their eyes kept narrowing at me. They showed all their teeth almost like a threatened dog would. After staring frozen for a good few seconds, I felt like I could move again. I quickly turned away from them and pulled my sleeping bag up high over my head, shaking. I barely slept the rest of the night. I never heard any noise or movement from the hallway, though. The next morning, it was all homemade pancakes and warm smiles yet again. I never told Natalie about any of this. I was pretty sure she would think I was either crazy or trying to prank her. Our friendship quickly faded a few years later anyway, which coincidentally was right around the time her parents got divorced. Recently, Natalie and her parents' divorce came up in conversation with my mom. She told me about a comment Natalie's mom had made to her a few years ago, back when Natalie and I were still super close. We had actually taken a few small road trip vacations together with our families. I guess at some point on one of these trips, our moms were gossiping about a particularly wealthy and impossibly perfect family that lived in our neighborhood and had a reputation of being somewhat pretentious. Natalie's mom was skeptical about their apparent perfection. She said, "Well, in this neighborhood, you never know what goes on behind closed doors." That comment is innocent enough on its face, but for me it adds an extra layer of creepiness given what I experienced with Natalie's parents. I'm a 26-year-old female, and exactly a year ago today, I was at a house party in rural Connecticut. A family friend was throwing a college graduation party for their daughter, and had invited what felt like the entire graduating class to their two-story home. It was an extremely spacious home, and felt kind of regal actually. It had balconies off each bedroom on the second story, 2 full-sized kitchens, and several dozen acres of mostly wide-open property surrounding the house. I was about 4 months pregnant at the time, and after a couple hours of socializing, I began to feel somewhat drained from mingling with dozens of people, most of whom I didn't really know. I retreated to one of the bedrooms upstairs to put my feet up. My husband came upstairs with me, and went into one of the bedrooms facing the backyard. Across the hall were several of the younger kids in another bedroom, playing video games together and cheering very loudly. As I lay on the bed, my husband sat beside me, rubbing one hand on my stomach while he sampled a variety of craft beers he had selected from downstairs. We were shooting the shit, and he was giving me his opinions on the various brews, as I couldn't sample them myself at the moment. After about 10 minutes or so, he started massaging my tired feet. It was at that point I happened to glance over to the table where the TV was and noticed something that seemed somewhat out of place. There was a flathead screwdriver perched awkwardly, practically hanging off the side of the table. The screwdriver by itself wouldn't have been too weird, but the fact it was extremely rusty and coated with old dirt made me suspicious. This didn't seem like something the owners of the house would be using, especially in a room where everything was so pristine. As strange as it was, I didn't really say anything to my husband. I didn't want anything to distract him from rubbing my feet. There's nothing sexier than a good foot massage after all. I'd say after another 10 minutes or so, my husband and I both jumped in surprise when someone started lighting off fireworks on the back lawn. An explosion of noise and red sparks suddenly came from outside the balcony window. The rowdy kids in the next room got very loud at the noise too. I heard them drop a few expletives. My husband walked over to the door and poked his head out into the hallway, calling for them to quiet down just a bit. That's when I turned my head and saw it outside on the balcony. There was someone looking in at me. I saw half of a person's face peering around the corner. The silhouette of their body outlined against an explosion of green fireworks. I screamed for my husband as the man outside turned the knob and walked into the bedroom. The best way I can describe the way this man looked is how Brandon Lee looked in the movie The Crow. He was tall, thin. His cheekbones and jawline looked like they were practically tearing themselves out from underneath his skin. He had long, greasy black hair and torn, ragged black clothing with heavy boots. He grabbed the screwdriver off the table without looking at me and disappeared back out onto the balcony. He was only in the bedroom for perhaps 4 seconds, but it was enough time for my husband to turn around and see him. He even shouted, "Who the fuck was that guy?" The man leapt off the second-story balcony. My husband dashed outside and called after him as he walked across the backyard and disappeared around the side of the house. There were around 60 people in the backyard, but most of them had their eyes on the fireworks. The music was so loud they couldn't hear my husband and I yelling. We immediately sprinted downstairs and told the homeowners, but they were half-plastered and didn't take what we said very seriously. My husband and I wanted to call the cops, but the owners blew off that notion like we were waiters offering them dessert. My husband returned upstairs and got all the kids to calm down. He told me that while he was up there, he checked on the lock to the balcony as well and reported it had been broken from the outside. We informed the handful of sober people we knew were there and left. To this day, I don't know who that man was. My husband suspects it might have been the eldest daughter's dealer, as it was her room we were chilling in. Frankly, I don't care who it was. He must have been out there on that balcony for at least 20 minutes, watching me and my husband as we sat peacefully inside. If he had wanted to, he could have easily made to stab either of us with his rusty screwdriver before he booked off into the night. We haven't gone back to that house since. Growing up, I lived in a small town in a heavily forested area. Around 2nd grade, my best friend, who shall be known as Celia, began complaining to me about some very strange things happening in her home. The first thing she pointed out to me was a small hole that appeared to be forming in the walls of her unfinished basement. The walls were made of a sort of brick cinder block type material, but expanding as if the bricks were crumbling. I remember asking Celia if her parents knew about this, and she told me they weren't worried. Fast forward some odd years later, around 4th or 5th grade. The hole had only become larger over time, and we could now even fit a large portion of our arms into the hole. As far as my entire arm could go, I still couldn't reach the end of this hole. We couldn't explain why it had corroded so deep into the house, but it hadn't gotten much bigger in girth. At this point, Celia began telling me that she could hear voices from her basement and that she believed most of it was coming from the hole. I never heard any of these sounds when I would visit her home, but considering we were only 10 years old when this happened, I totally believed her. We frequently had sleepovers on weekends, which was when I usually was exposed to all the creepy things wrong with their house. Her family was kind of strange in the fact they had an abnormal amount of animals. They had 6 cats and dogs, a few rabbits, birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish. You name it. Around the time when she began hearing the voices, we began to notice her cats and dogs would randomly disappear and be found later in the basement standing right in front of the hole. In all the years I've known her and the animals, they never liked to be in the basement. It started to really scare us. She was telling me she believed there was something living in the walls and that the hole was one of the places it would peer into the house through. At this point in time, I did believe her, but I'd never really seen enough proof to be as scared as she was. At school, she spent most of her time an anxious wreck. The teachers and the other classmates were really worried about her. It seemed like her parents just didn't care. A lot of the adults believe she was only anxious because her older sister had left for college. Now here's where we get to the really terrifying part. I was sleeping over at her house during the weekend over the Christmas holiday. A side note about Celia's room is that she has a huge collection of stuffed animals of all sizes, clearly because of her family's love for animals. Anyway, the first night we were sleeping in her bed, when we woke up the next morning, all the animals were facing and staring right at us. I don't believe now, and I didn't believe at the time either, that Celia could have moved all these toys by herself. I've always been an extremely light sleeper, and some of the animals were on top of a very large wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia believed to be hiding in the walls had to have been responsible for this. We put back all the animals very carefully, and never told her parents. I sort of wish we had now, since I was staying the entire weekend. We went again to sleep in her bed the next night. We woke up around the same time. It was still dark out, and we could hear a very low creaking noise that was coming from underneath us. We both knew it was the wooden floorboards under her bed, just like a textbook horror movie. Probably because we were only 10, we thought it was a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look underneath. Right as we looked down, we saw and heard one of the raised floorboards slamming back into the ground. We shot our heads back up and held each other and cried. I had never been so scared in my entire life. I called my parents the next morning to come and take me home right away. I refused to ever go back to Celia's house, in fear. She only got worse at school. I don't remember if I continued to ask her about the things in her house. Maybe I didn't because I was just too scared, and we were too young. For unrelated circumstances, my family moved far away from that town that summer, and I'd only seen her twice after that. That was over a decade ago, and I haven't heard from her ever since. I've always wondered what happened, and what was up with that hole. As far as I know, her family still lives in that house today. Many have suggested this might be paranormal or something. I tried to be very detailed and left out my personal thoughts on the matter. The scariest part anyways is not knowing. My theory is that there was a man living in the walls of her house, and that hole was their way of peeking around and seeing what was going on outside. Whenever no one was in the basement, they would use the floorboards to come out. The stuffed animals had to have been moved by someone who was disturbed and wanted to mess with us. That floorboard trick must have been a way to peek out and see if we were still sleeping. Since I only saw one floorboard move though, there's no way of knowing if that was really how they got into the room. They probably had many surveillance points, so they knew when they could move around the house. I don't really believe it was a paranormal encounter in any way. When I was about 8 or 9, an area near me opened up a new arcade. I was at the mall with my mom, and I don't remember why specifically. I asked her if we could stop by the arcade so I could play one of the games there. She gave me some quarters and I walked inside. She sat on a bench right out front. I'm walking about this arcade, trying to find a game I really want to play. Suddenly, this grown man walked up to me. Couldn't have been any younger than 30 years old. "Ma'am?" I looked at him confused. "You're so pretty." I didn't know how to respond. I was a little kid, and this was a grown-ass man. I mumbled out a frightened thank you and shuffled away. I asked my mom if we could leave right now. She was a little bit confused, but we left right away. On the way back, we decided to stop at a yard sale. As I'm perusing the items, I see that very same guy across the street, waving at me. He had this excited grin on his face, like he was so thrilled to see me there. I asked my mom once again if we could leave. We left and decided to do a little shopping at Kohl's. As we were walking to the front door though, I see this guy getting out of his car in the lot. I told my mom I just wanted to go home. I don't know if that guy was actually following me, but for him to come up to me, a child, and basically try to hit on me, then I see him everywhere I go for the rest of the day, I don't know. seemed a bit sketchy to me. When I was 10 years old, my friend and I took a walk down to the Quick Stop, which was about 3/4 of a mile away from my house. We wanted to buy some Slurpees. When we were about 1 block away, though, this beat-up-looking white car pulled up right behind us and started honking its horn at us repeatedly. There were 2 skeevy-looking guys inside. We got pretty scared and started hurrying toward the store. As we did so, the car accelerated straight towards us, driving straight up onto the sidewalk and barely managing to brake before running us down. All the while, the driver was honking and laughing. Needless to say, we were terrified. We ran to the Quick Stop. I told my friend to memorize the first half of the license plate number, while I memorized the second half. When we got inside, we asked the attendant if we could use the phone to call the police. He wouldn't let us. I asked him to call the police on his own because someone was following us, but he refused to do it. We waited for the adrenaline rush to die down, and then walked home without ever receiving our Slurpees. Fucking Quick Stop douchebag. We ran all the way home, looking over our shoulders as we did. I called the police once we got there, and they said that car had been seen doing suspicious things like this for quite a while. That was the first time they ever got the full license plate, though. To this day, I still remember the license plate number of that car, and I get jimmies every time I see someone that looks like that driver. Not the scariest, but this is all I can really offer right now. I was camping in May of last year. I was meeting up with my buddies, so instead of pitching a tent for only one night, I just slept in my car instead. I put my seats down, stuck my legs through the trunk, and cracked open my windows. Good night me. Some undetermined amount of time later, though, my phone was in the front seat so I couldn't check it. I heard a loud grunting and what sounded like something walking on sticks around my car. I shit you not. I turned my head, only to see a massive grizzly bear staring me dead in the eyes. It was looking in through my window, with one claw hanging inside my car where my window was open. I was fucking terrified. We stared each other down, until eventually the bear just walked away. Knowing you're literally a few inches and a car's door away from being Leonardo DiCaprio'd was very unsettling. Needless to say, I could not sleep very well after. A few years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I came back from my dorm kind of late, around midnight or so. I had 3 other suite mates, and we had a suite-style dorm. That means a living room that connected to a bathroom and 2 bedrooms. 2 of my suite mates were still out for the night, and my roommate was in our room on his computer. I took a shower, but when leaving the bathroom and turning the lights off, I stepped into the living room. I turned off those lights too, intending to go into our bedroom for the rest of the night. As I turned off those lights though, I quickly turned around and noticed that all of a sudden I could see glowing handprints on every wall of the living room. I quickly flipped the lights back on, only to see no more handprints. Just as I was getting goosebumps popping up on my arms, a knock at the door made me jump. Suitemate number 1 had just returned. "Hey, stand there and close the door. Take a look at this." Okay. I flipped the lights off and waited for about 5 seconds. All the handprints started to appear again. Holy shit, what the fuck, dude? I flipped the lights on again and they all went away. Now my suitemate and I were both wide-eyed and extremely creeped out. We had been living there for 4 months and we'd never seen anything like this before. Another knock came and suitemate number 2 returned home as well. We do the same thing, and again the same response. I say to them both, let's wait with the lights off and tell each other what we see, okay? Turns out there were not only handprints all over the walls, but as we looked up, also on the ceiling. There were giant, creepy, smiling faces and writing we couldn't quite make out. That was, except for one phrase written on the wall right by us: "Get out." A good amount of yelling commenced. Upon closer inspection, we realized it was all written in glow-in-the-dark paint. Who had put this all here? When did they have the opportunity to do so? We had no idea. 3 weeks later, my roommate, who had been on his computer with headphones and had missed this whole ordeal, was in the bathroom when our power went out. He emerged screaming, talking about faces in the walls of the bathroom, then started yelling some more when he realized the whole dorm had them. That part was fairly amusing. Last October, I took a trip from Washington State to Texas with my boyfriend. He had a great uncle who had passed away and left him a dozen acres of property or so in his will. We flew down to inspect the land and decide whether to keep it or sell the property. It was pretty much a wide open patch of dirt with a nice view of the hills around. Without much to offer us, we decided to sell most of it and build a small house on the land that was left over. We were going to live there during the winter months and rent it out during the summer. After the house was finished building, we flew back down and moved ourselves in for the remainder of the winter. It wasn't anything super lavish, just something simple and small. Something the two of us could enjoy together. After about a week of us being there, we were sitting on the front porch when a dusty old pickup truck with deer antlers mounted on the top of the cab came rolling up. A middle-aged couple got out and approached us in a friendly manner, introducing themselves as former neighbors of my boyfriend's great uncle. The couple seemed pleasant enough, and they even brought a 12-pack of Shiner beer with them. I thought it was kind of presumptuous of them, being complete strangers and showing up completely unannounced, but I figured this must be how people do things down south. We didn't really know anyone in the area anyway, and figured we might as well try to make a few friends while they were here. They introduced themselves as Reuben and Charlotte Wallace. They said they had been hunting buddies with old Uncle Trevor and told stories of their camping trips, shooting the heads off snakes and whatnot. They were polite enough people, but their southern boldness and casual way of discussing killing animals for sport was very foreign to me. I didn't really form any sort of connection with them. My boyfriend, though, seemed to enjoy their company slightly more, and when they invited us over for dinner the following night, he accepted before even consulting with me, which was quite irritating. The following night, we arrived at their very old farmhouse, which was much farther away from Uncle Trevor's former place than we had been expecting. We brought some wine and beer, not knowing what they preferred to have with dinner. We were greeted before we even reached the front door by Charlotte. The house reeked of cigarette smoke and had a kind of musky, unhealthy feeling to it, like the very house itself was rotting from the inside out. Every room seemed to have at least one American flag, one firearm, and one mounted animal head. I really wasn't digging it at all, but my boyfriend seemed unperturbed, so I didn't hesitate to crack open a beer with good old Reuben. We were eating in their dining room, seated next to their wide-open sliding patio door, which I thought was strange. There were a bunch of bugs flying in. We were eating a very unimaginative meal of beans and what they claimed to be venison, but if it was, I don't think it had been preserved properly, or at the very least, it was extremely undercooked. I had tried venison before, and this didn't taste right. After 20 minutes, the casual conversation ended, and instead, more interesting and meaningful conversations started up. Things began to get kind of awkward and quiet. Reuben began paying more attention and stroking his beard, looking at us rather than the food. He began to ask us questions about the uncle's old house and personal possessions. If he had ever mentioned them to us, I began to get a very uneasy feeling in my gut that the Wallaces here were digging for information about old Uncle Trevor. They were slowly starting to drop that whole friendly southern neighbor act. My boyfriend didn't have very many answers for them, as he rarely spoke to his uncle when he was growing up. Instead of taking the hint, though, they kept on pressing us, Charlotte kept staring right at me, watching me eat as she shoveled food in between her gray teeth, hardly even blinking. I decided to excuse myself for a smoke and wandered outside out the open patio door. She said I was free to light up at the table, but I was already outside. I didn't actually want to smoke anyway. I was just using it as a signal to tip my boyfriend off that I was uncomfortable and wanted to leave. I wandered out around their backyard and walked around behind their shed, thinking I could at least snap some pictures with my phone of the horizon as the sun set. There was a terrible smell coming from the shed that practically made me gag. It reminded me of a forgotten dumpster that had been baking in the sun for years. I took a few pictures and casually started making my way back to the house, when I noticed about 15 or 20 pairs of shoes, mostly sneakers and cowboy boots, piled in a heap on the far side of the shed. I walked over to get a better look and noticed they appeared to be all different sizes. Some were so old and dusty I could barely make out what the original color was they had been. I got a sinking feeling in my stomach and cautiously pushed open the shed door. Inside, there were piles upon piles of clothes, hats and backpacks scattered all around the shed, like a nightmarish Goodwill drop-off location. Dark stains heavily covered the creaking wooden floor. I noticed the stains formed a pattern like a trail that led to the door, indicating that multiple things had been dragged out of this shed over time. I backed away, suddenly feeling very nauseous. My heart nearly failed me when Charlotte was suddenly standing right behind me. She started to say something along the lines of, "Now why did you go sneaking your head in there?" That's when I noticed she had a serrated knife in her hand. I've been taught self-defense for young women for many years, so before she could do anything, I struck the heel of my palm directly up to her nose. It was surprisingly fragile and broke right away, blood spurting into the air. I screamed for my boyfriend, who came running out of the patio door toward me. I kicked the knife she had dropped across the dirt and cried for him to run. We sprinted for the car and floored it backwards out of the driveway. Ruben appeared on the front porch and fired a shot from his rifle at our car. Fortunately, though, he missed. By the time he raised the rifle for a second shot, we'd made it to the road and drove like hell out of there. We didn't go home, but instead drove right into town to the police station, where I gave my statement. They sent 3 cars to the house, and we heard an exchange of gunfire over the radio. Ruben was killed at the scene in the shootout, but Charlotte was never found. The police couldn't locate her on the property. An APB was put out for her at local hospitals, just in case she sought treatment for her nose, but nothing ever came of it. We returned home for the night, and a police cruiser remained parked outside their house until dawn a few days later. A detective came by our house and determined that Ruben and Charlotte Wallace were fake names the couple had given us. They apparently were 2 fugitives wanted for several counts of attempted murder in Arizona. Apparently, they made a habit of patrolling the border and shot at any illegals they found trying to cross it. From there, it seemed like they brought the bodies back to their property for disposal. It turns out Uncle Trevor had known about their activities and had been blackmailing them to keep him quiet. I had to excuse myself to go vomit. I didn't know for sure, therefore I didn't say anything to the police. But in my bones, I had a distinct feeling they served us human meat that day. I can't really be sure, though. For exactly what reason, I had no idea. But some reporters came to interview us. We refused to comment on anything. My boyfriend and I still spend our time between Washington and Texas. Though when I say we stay in Texas, we have 2 pit bulls sleep on our front porch to alert us if anyone unwelcome is approaching. To the best of my knowledge, they never found Charlotte, and if she's still out there, I pray that we never meet again. It happened during my freshman year of college, when I was back in my hometown for Thanksgiving break. I'm from a small town in New England, the kind of place you can't wait to get away from because nothing ever happens there. I guess maybe this was my town's way of getting back at me for thinking along those lines. It was late on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I was at a friend's house, happily reunited with my best friends from high school, since we were all home for the holidays. A fog had settled in that night, owing to the classic New England mix of chill and humidity. As I drove home, I passed by our town's library, which was situated next to a small duck pond. The fog was extra thick out over the water, and illuminated by the lampposts surrounding the pond, it gave an eerie golden glow. Being the film student that I was, I had my camera with me as always. Without even thinking, I turned my car around and pulled into the library parking lot, which overlooked that pond. I considered walking down to it for a moment, but something was telling me not to do that. It wasn't exactly fear, not yet. I remember not feeling any fear at all, actually, just excitement and awe at the beautiful sight in front of me. Still though, I did not get out of my car. That decision probably saved my life. Instead, I kept my car running, headlights still on. I rolled down my window and stuck my arm out of it, taking a few photos of the pond. I pulled my arm back inside and looked through the photos. They were terrible given how bad of a technique I was using. This was the first time something felt really wrong. As I looked at all the photos I'd just taken, I felt, well, the best way I can think to explain it is that sometimes I have these nightmares about being in open water. I can feel there are sharks swimming beneath me, but I can't see them. I know they're there though. That's the kind of feeling I was feeling right now, only in my waking life and not in a dream. As I continued to look through these pictures trying to see what was wrong here, I felt the danger before I even saw it. I looked up from my camera fully alert and rolled my window back up. I peered in front of me, but saw nothing for a moment. All of a sudden though, a figure materialized out of the darkness around the pond and into the beams of my headlights. It was a man. He was wearing dark jeans and a black zip-up jacket. His hair was dark and short, and I couldn't see his face at all. He was walking in the direction of the library, specifically in the direction of my car. I waited, not wanting to let my fear take over. Maybe he wasn't really walking toward me. Maybe he was just going toward the road. He kept getting faster though, and getting closer to me. All of a sudden, he was right in front of the hood of my car. I could tell beyond a shadow of a doubt he was staring straight at me. His face was expressionless, but the look in his eyes was intent, determined. The moment we made eye contact, I saw that look and just reacted. I don't remember feeling fear or panic, just suddenly being very alert. I never took my eyes off the man as I threw my car into reverse and spun out of the parking lot. I went the wrong way though. Instead of turning my car toward the exit, I'd spun around toward the back parking lot. Yes, there was another exit I could get to, but I would have to drive around the entire library to get there. Either that or reverse all the way out onto the road and risk hitting something. A tree, another car. I didn't want to risk crashing. Then I'd have no escape. I decided I would have to go around the library. It would take longer, but it was the safest option. All these thoughts went through my head in an instant. The man ran in front of my car. One of the biggest regrets in my life is not just running him over then and there. I put my car in drive and waited. He stopped running once he was right in front, then took his time and walked slowly around the hood of my car, staring at me the whole time. Our eyes followed each other, and he smiled the moment he was clear of the front of my car. Two things happened in that moment. He lunged at my car door, and I floored it at the same time. I remember the sight of my car sailing right past his outstretched hand. I drove as fast as I've ever driven, taking the corners at speed around the library. As I came out the other side, the exit was in sight, but the man no longer was. I drove as fast as I could toward the exit. As I got in front of the library again, I looked over and saw the man running as fast as he could to get to my car. I sped out of the lot and onto the main road. The police station was only a block away, so I made a beeline for it, still driving recklessly fast. I got to the police station, and that's when the fear finally settled in. I sat in my car and cried, breathing raggedly, completely frozen. I couldn't even get out. I was terrified the man had somehow followed me there. That as soon as I emerged from my vehicle, he would grab me. An officer came out to my car and escorted me inside. They must have seen me on their security cameras, I guess. I spoke with a female sergeant and told her what happened, gave her the best description I could. They immediately sent cars out but found no one there. I assumed the man was after my car, my camera maybe. I said that out loud to the sergeant. She looked at me and shook her head though. What she told me next I'll never forget. I don't think he was after your car or your camera. I think he was after you.